Let us pray in the words of today's psalm. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. There's actually a lot going on in this passage we heard this morning from Mark's Gospel. And even though it's only 12 relatively short verses, it can actually be divided into three distinct parts. And what I would suggest is that this series of sayings or teachings from Jesus, these three parts, actually give us a blueprint for what apostolic or communal or congregational Christian discipleship is really supposed to look like. First, let's take what we can call the whoever is not against us is for us section of the passage. Naturally, questions and disputes began to emerge among those early followers of Jesus about who was really authorized to represent God. And the way that Jesus responds here is terribly important because what he's essentially saying is that we should not take a rigidly hierarchical view of Christian ministry. Rather, we should take what one commentator refers to as a broad-minded view. In other words, yes, we have these disciples who were close to Jesus. He had called them. He had taught and trained them specifically and sent them out to be what we might consider to be his official representatives. But Jesus is also making clear here, I think, that his presence and that God's inbreaking kingdom could not be mediated by only a few certain people. Rather, his love would go on to be made known and shown in very real and powerful instances through what we might consider to be irregular or unofficial ways. Written into the very fabric of our call and purpose as an apostolic community, I would argue, is this diversity of leadership and expression, an invitation to serve in both official and unofficial ways. In other words, God's Spirit cannot be institutionalized or confined in any way to our control. It moves as it wills. Now, for anyone who knows anything about this church, you may think I'm on somewhat shaky ground here as a faith leader in a denomination that is virtually by every estimation both institutional and hierarchical. But listen, if you will, to how our prayer book defines the ministry of every single layperson, that is, every single one of you, in our catechism. Quote, the ministry of every layperson is to represent Christ and his church, to bear witness to him wherever they may be, and according to the gifts given to them to carry out Christ's work of reconciliation in the world and to take their place in the life, worship, and governance of the church. It's right there in our prayer book. We all have a place and a role. There is, in fact, no such thing in this church or in any church as an insignificant or unofficial follower or representative of Christ. Our task, then, I think, is to discern how we might be faithful to Christ's unique call on our lives without being tempted to judge how or why Christ has called a brother or sister into his or her own work. The second section in this passage is what we might consider to be the whoever gives you a cup of cold water to drink. It's all about showing generosity and kindness, especially in small and humble ways. There's actually no such thing, Jesus would tell us, as too small a gesture. In fact, and I love how the Message translation says, God will notice it no matter whatever it is. It's probably, in fact, what we need more of in this world, the small gestures that will ultimately give way to big change. God will notice, and so should we. We should actually pay keen and special attention to how Christ's love is made known in this world by those who might not be as practiced or as learned in the faith as those who we think are official. Theirs is the example that we should seek to follow and emulate. I heard a great quote on the radio earlier this week, and it's been with me ever since. To be meek is not to be weak. To be meek is not to be weak. We can be strong and lead. In fact, we're called to be strong and lead in our families, in our work, in our community, while still also demonstrating grace, humility, patience, and forbearance. It is possible to do both. And Jesus tells us, in fact, that is required of us in our walk. Jesus tells his disciples, and he tells us to be salt, and elsewhere he says to be light. Both have purifying and preserving qualities. Both provide good and necessary functions in the ordered world. Being salt is, we might say, about being friendly and hospitable, willing to notice and help, always bringing a certain energy and joy and grace and humility into our relationships and our daily tasks. This is the kind of thing that can make a real difference. There's no deed so small that it will go unnoticed. Anybody who would give a cold cup of water, which, by the way, for me today is a gift. I brought it myself, but the third section is what we might call the if any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones section. And yes, it is intense. This section warns of the dangers of leading others astray. And here the burden is actually on those of us who serve as leaders, those, that is, who serve in more official ways. And the language is graphic, it's emphatic. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. If your eye causes you to stumble, pull it out, and so forth. Keep in mind, though, that Jesus is speaking here these things to people who were generally trying to do their best to follow in his way, to be faithful to his new law of love. And so it sort of meant to shake them loose from their feelings of complacency that had already begun to emerge. Feelings of competition. Remember, they just had argued about who would be the greatest. This teaching, graphic as it is meant to underscore the fact that there's no room for possessiveness or defensiveness or territorialism in God's kingdom. There's no place for what one commentator rightly described as self-centeredness or one-upsmanship. It's meant to remind us that we need to be careful about the kind of example that we set. Jesus, keep in mind, is constantly striking out at the Pharisees because of their self-righteousness, their puffed upness, their unwillingness, among other things, to notice and to help those in need, those who were doing small things to great effect. Perhaps Jesus then simply doesn't want us to end up like them because, oh, so easily it can happen. The letter of James takes this one step further. We have to be sure, he insists, that we don't allow people to become isolated or worse yet, to be driven out of their community. If someone's sick, we are to pray for them, to go lay hands on them. If someone is estranged or isolated or lost, just like the shepherd who leaves the 99 to go after the one, which, by the way, makes absolutely no sense whatsoever unless you're the one who happens to be lost. Just like that, James says we have to make every effort to reach out, reconcile, and restore, to bring people back. So how do these teachings have any meaning or bearing on this community at this particular time? Well, there are a couple of ministries I want to lift up, namely our youth ministry, 6th through 12th grade, and our budding new ministry to young adults, that is, folks who are in their 20s and 30s. In both cases, and I hope you've noticed, we've had incredible lay volunteers step up into positions of leadership, and there's been this groundswell of very exciting energy and support, this beautiful fruit being born on new branches. And in both cases, I think it's important to say there's this tension, this stated tension, this need and desire for official representation. And trust me, I know, I've heard it Let me be clear, we're working on it. We're trying to find someone to come help in that way. But for now, my question to the community is this. Aren't these ministries in this moment following in the very same blueprint that Jesus describes in today's gospel? This very same tension has played itself out in a slightly different way several times in this community when it comes to the outreach ministries of this parish. So many people here are involved in so many ways, giving back to the community, active and charitable groups, community foundations, other philanthropic efforts. And there's always this stated desire, and I get it, to be more formally, corporately, officially connected to these ministry efforts as a parish, even though while these efforts could likely never be quantified, there's just so much that happens, they could very likely be traced back to the support and encouragement that every individual gets through their connection and their relationship here at St. Peter's. So many seemingly small gestures that have major impacts. And again, none of them are necessarily official, but certainly none of them are insignificant. Our job, I think, is to notice, to recognize, to give thanks, and to then offer to help. And on the other side of the leadership coin, if you will, to state what might be obvious to some, but what I think needs to be said anyway, there are still, for as many new members as we have here, and it's really remarkable as many new members as we have here, there's still quite a few stalwart members of our St. Peter's family who have not yet found their way back to church after an extended hiatus. Perhaps some are worried about their health and safety and that of others. That I understand. But just as many, if not more, I'm sure have simply fallen into bad habits, consciously or unconsciously. Some for reasons I know, others for reasons I'm sure I don't know. Many of these folks would be considered more on the official end of the spectrum when it comes to leadership in this parish. They've been active, they've been involved in various ways over the years, and many of them are our friends and our neighbors. And so I wonder if this blueprint for ministry that we've received this morning in Mark's gospel might be a reminder to us, if James's teaching might be a reminder to us that God sometimes calls us to call on our friends when they're sick, when they're estranged, when they're isolated, when they've wandered away, and to invite them back to a place that we all so love and so need. I wonder if those of us who are more official might think anew about the example that we aim to set in this place. Our baptismal theology is that all of our gifts are both activated and animated by the one same Spirit and in service to the one same living Lord. And they're all needed. We're all needed as we work together towards common goods and common goals. This is the kind of community that Jesus describes that he seeks to build up in his name. This is how, in the words of one author, we can partner fully with God, and I love this, flood the world with his presence. This is how we can flood the world with his presence, I would add, in both official and unofficial ways. Now, if this is true, and I think that it is, I believe very strongly that it is, wouldn't we want to be a part of this plan, this blueprint for ministry? Wouldn't we want to eagerly reach out to others, to extend the invitation to come or to come back? And wouldn't it be, when it's set in motion, this kind of community, this kind of transformational community, wouldn't it be a compelling and countercultural example of how God's love and peace is actively triumphing over every fear and worry that we might have? I pray that it would, and I pray that we will. In God's name, amen.